Row 14, right next to the service area. That's where they put me at my own son's wedding. Behind the photographers, behind the florists, behind the caterers who kept bumping my chair as they rushed past with champagne. I'm 67 years old. I spent 38 years as a public school teacher. I raised my son alone after my husband died when the boy was just 12. I worked summer jobs, tutored on weekends, took out loans. I'm still paying off all so he could have the life I never did. And on the day he married into one of the wealthiest families in Virginia, his bride leaned close to my ear and whispered, "Your poverty will embarrass us. Please don't speak to anyone important." I gripped my champagne glass so hard I heard it crack. I didn't cry. I lifted my chin and walked to that last row like I was stepping over the worst humiliation of my life. And then a man in an elegant black suit sat down beside me. Silver hair, deep blue eyes, a Swiss watch that probably cost more than my car. He placed his hand gently over mine and whispered, "Let's pretend we came together." When my son looked down from the altar and saw us, his face turned white, because the man sitting next to me was about to change everything. And the family that tried to erase me from the picture had no idea what was coming. By the end of this story, you will witness a moment of reckoning that none of them saw coming. You will understand why. Sometimes the people who are pushed to the margins hold more power than anyone realizes. And you will see exactly what happens when a mother who has been silenced for years finally decides to speak. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by the people who should love you most, stay with me. This story might feel like your own. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Eleanor Grace Whitfield. Ellie to anyone who knew me before I became Mrs. Whitfield or Mom or that teacher from Jefferson High. I was born in 1,957 inches, a small town outside Richmond, Virginia. My father repaired tractors for the local farms, spending his days covered in grease and his evenings too tired to complain about it. My mother took in laundry from the wealthy families on the hill, the same families whose children I would later teach in my classroom. We weren't poor in spirit, but we were poor in everything else. I remember my mother pressing her one good dress before church every Sunday, the same navy blue dress she wore for 15 years until the fabric grew thin at the elbows. I remember my father's hands, always cracked from engine grease, always gentle when he tucked me in at night and told me I was meant for something more than this town could offer. My mother used to say something that stayed with me through every hardship I would face. She would look me in the eyes and tell me that dignity isn't something anyone can give you, and it's not something anyone can take away. "It lives in your spine," she would say. "You carry it with you, or you don't carry it at all." I carried those words with me through everything that followed, through the years of scraping by, through the nights of grading papers until my eyes burned, through raising a child alone when I had no idea how I was going to pay the electric bill. My mother's voice was always there, reminding me that no matter what anyone said or did, my worth was not theirs to determine. I just never imagined I would need those words most at my own son's wedding, surrounded by people who had decided I wasn't worth a seat at the table. I married Thomas Whitfield when I was 24 years old. He was a carpenter by trade, a man with honest hands and a warm laugh that could fill a room. He was the kind of man who remembered every anniversary without being reminded, who never raised his voice, even when he was frustrated, and who treated me like I was the most important person in any room we walked into together. We had one son together, Daniel. Born in the spring of 1982 on a Tuesday morning when the dogwoods were blooming outside the hospital window. Thomas held him first, and I watched my husband cry for the only time in our marriage. He looked at me and said, "This boy is going to have everything we didn't." I believed him. We both believed we had all the time in the world to make that promise come true. We were wrong. Thomas died of a heart attack when Daniel was 12 years old. One morning, he was making pancakes in the kitchen, humming some old song he'd heard on the radio. By noon, he was gone. The doctors said it was sudden, that there was nothing anyone could have done. But that didn't make it easier. That didn't explain to a 12-year-old boy why his father wasn't coming home. That didn't tell me how I was supposed to be both parents to a child who needed two. I became everything after that. Mother and father, provider and counselor, disciplinarian and soft place to land. I taught English during the day and graded papers until midnight. I tutored wealthy kids on weekends so my own son could attend the same summer camps they did. I took out loans I couldn't afford so Daniel could go to the schools that would open doors for him. Everything I did for Daniel. And for a long time, I believed it mattered. I believed he would remember. Daniel was a good boy. That's what everyone said. Teachers loved him. Coaches praised him. He was polite, hard-working, the kind of kid who held doors open for strangers and said please and thank you without being prompted. When he got into a good college on a partial scholarship, I cried in the parking lot after we dropped him off. Not because I was sad, but because I had done it. I had gotten him there. All those years of sacrifice had led to this moment, watching my son walk toward a future I could never have imagined for myself. He called me every Sunday during his freshman year, then every other Sunday during his sophomore year. By his junior year, the calls came once a month if I was lucky. I told myself it was normal. Kids grow up. They get busy. They have their own lives to build. I told myself a lot of things during those years. Most of them weren't true. After college, Daniel moved to Washington for a job at a consulting firm. He was doing well, he said, making connections, climbing the ladder, becoming someone. I was proud of him. I told everyone I knew about my son, the consultant, my son who had made it out, my son who was living the life I had always dreamed he would have. And then, 4 years ago, he called to tell me he had met someone. Her name was Victoria Ashford, and she came from a family I had only read about in newspapers. Old Virginia money, the kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself because everyone already knows. Daniel sounded different when he talked about her. Nervous, almost, like he was asking for my approval, but also warning me that it wouldn't matter if I didn't give it. I told him I was happy for him. I told him I couldn't wait to meet her. I meant it at the time. The first time I met Victoria Ashford, I understood immediately that something had shifted in my relationship with my son. We met at a restaurant in Washington, the kind of place where the menu has no prices because the people who eat there don't need to ask. Victoria arrived wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile perfectly practiced. She looked at my modest cardigan and sensible flats the way someone looks at a stain on expensive upholstery. She extended her hand like she was granting me an audience rather than greeting her future mother-in-law. "So you're a teacher," she said, making the word sound like something unfortunate. "Public school," I replied. 38 years. She tilted her head and offered a thin smile. "How noble," she said, in a tone that suggested she found it anything but. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to say something. My son, who used to hold my hand in grocery stores when he was small, who wrote me cards every Mother's Day calling me his hero, just stared at his wine glass and said nothing. The Ashford family traced their lineage back to colonial governors. They owned properties across 3 states, including summer homes they called cottages, despite having 12 bedrooms and full-time staff. Victoria's father served on the boards of 4 major corporations. Her mother, Patricia, chaired charity galas that raised more money in one evening than I had earned in 5 years of teaching. These were people who measured worth in generations of accumulated wealth, in last names that appeared in history books, in connections that opened doors I didn't even know existed. And my son, the boy I had raised alone, the child I had sacrificed everything for, wanted desperately to belong in their world. I watched him change during the engagement. His clothes became more expensive. His vocabulary shifted. He started correcting my grammar and conversations, something he had never done before. He visited less often, and when he did, he seemed embarrassed by the smallness of my house, by the age of my furniture, by everything that reminded him of where he came from. The engagement party was held at the Ashford estate, a sprawling property that made me feel like I had wandered onto a movie set. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed impossibly high. Waiters in white gloves circulated with champagne that cost more per bottle than my weekly grocery budget. I wore my nicest dress, a simple black number I had owned for years, and I tried to make myself invisible among the guests in their designer gowns and tailored suits. I was standing near a window, watching the sun set over the manicured gardens, when I heard Patricia Ashford's voice behind me. She was speaking to a group of women, and she clearly didn't know I was there. Or perhaps she didn't care. Daniel has done so well to rise above his circumstances, Patricia said, her voice dripping with condescension. It's a shame about the mother. She's so provincial. I don't know how Victoria will manage having her at family events. The women around her laughed softly, the polite laughter of people who agree but don't want to seem cruel. I stood frozen, my champagne glass trembling in my hand, and then I saw Daniel. He was standing just a few feet away from Patricia, close enough to hear every word. He looked at me for a brief moment, something flickering in his eyes that might have been guilt or might have been annoyance. Then he turned away and joined another conversation, leaving me standing there alone with the echo of his future mother-in-law's contempt. The wedding was held at the Ashford family estate on a Saturday in late September. The weather was perfect, as if even nature had been hired to cooperate with Patricia's meticulous planning. White roses covered every surface. A string quartet played softly near the private chapel where the ceremony would take place. Luxury cars lined the long driveway, each one worth more than my house. I arrived in my old Honda Civic, the one I had driven for 11 years, and parked it at the far end of the lot where it wouldn't be too visible among the Mercedes and Bentleys. I had spent 3 weeks searching for the right dress, something that would allow me to look respectable without appearing to try too hard. I settled on navy blue, simple and elegant, with small pearl earrings that Thomas had given me for our 10th anniversary. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror and took a deep breath. This was my son's wedding day. Whatever had happened between us, whatever distance had grown, this was still a day to celebrate. I told myself that everything would be fine. The wedding coordinator found me before I had taken 10 steps from my car. She was a thin woman with a clipboard and a smile that never reached her eyes. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, pronouncing my name like she had rehearsed it. "You'll be seated in row 14, near the service area, Mrs. Ashford felt you would be more comfortable away from the principal guests." I stared at her for a moment, certain I had misheard. "Row 14, I repeated. The coordinator nodded briskly and gestured toward the seating area. The chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing the altar. I could see row 1 from where I stood, positioned directly in front, with the best view of everything. That's where Patricia and Richard Ashford would sit, along with their closest friends and most important connections. Rows 2 through 10 were filled with business associates, politicians, philanthropists, people whose names I had only read in newspapers. Row 14 was at the very back, behind the photographers, behind the florists, directly next to the area where caterers staged their trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The mother of the groom had been seated with the staff. Before I could say anything, before I could even process what was happening, Victoria appeared at my side. She was stunning in her designer gown, a cascade of white silk that seemed to float around her as she moved. Diamonds glittered at her throat and in her perfectly arranged hair. She smiled at me, but the smile was for the cameras that were already documenting the day. Her eyes were cold. "Eleanor," she whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. "I need you to understand something. This is the most important day of my life. Your poverty will embarrass us. Please don't speak to anyone important. Don't draw attention to yourself. Just sit where you're told and try not to ruin this for everyone." She pulled back, the smile still frozen on her face, and then she floated away toward a group of guests who greeted her with air kisses and exclamations of admiration. I stood there in the September sunshine, surrounded by white roses and crystal champagne flutes, and I felt something crack inside me. Not my heart. My heart had been cracking slowly for years. This was something else. This was the moment I finally understood exactly where I stood in my son's new life. I could have left. The thought crossed my mind as I stood there watching Victoria disappear into the crowd of well-dressed guests. I could have walked back to my old Honda Civic and driven away from this place, from these people who had made it so clear that I didn't belong. I could have caused a scene, raised my voice, demanded to speak to my son, and asked him how he could allow this to happen. I could have cried, let the tears fall down my face in front of everyone, forced them to see the pain they had caused. But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I remembered my mother's voice, the words she had spoken to me so many times when I was young. "Dignity lives in your spine, Ellie. You carry it with you, or you don't carry it at all. I straightened my shoulders, I lifted my chin, and I walked to row 14, like I was stepping over the worst humiliation of my entire life, because that is exactly what I was doing. I found my seat next to the service area, sat down on the cold metal folding chair, and I waited for my son's wedding to begin. I had no idea that everything was about to change in ways I never could have imagined. The orchestra began playing the wedding march, and I sat in row 14, gripping my small purse like it was the only thing keeping me anchored to the earth. Through the sea of designer hats and perfectly styled hair, I could barely make out Daniel at the altar. He stood there in his tailored suit, looking every inch the successful consultant he had become, a man who had successfully erased every trace of the small-town boy who used to help me fold laundry on Sunday afternoons. Victoria began her procession down the aisle, her gown trailing behind her like a river of silk, two attendants carefully managing the train so it wouldn't catch on the rose petals scattered across the white runner. The guests rose in unison, their faces turned toward the bride with expressions of practiced admiration. Cameras clicked steadily, capturing every moment of this perfect society wedding. No one looked back at row 14. No one noticed the mother of the groom, sitting alone next to the service station where waiters were quietly arranging champagne glasses for the reception. I was exactly where they wanted me to be, invisible. The chair beside me suddenly shifted, and I turned, startled to find someone sitting down. A man had appeared without my noticing his approach, settling into the seat with the kind of effortless grace that comes from a lifetime of belonging wherever he chose to be. His hair was silver, perfectly styled without looking overly managed. He wore a black suit that had clearly been tailored specifically for him, the fabric expensive enough that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A Swiss watch gleamed subtly at his wrist, the kind of timepiece that costs more than most people's annual salaries. But it was his eyes that made me catch my breath. Deep blue, like the ocean at dusk, holding something I couldn't quite identify. Amusement, perhaps, or maybe tenderness. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms and private clubs. Someone who never had to raise his voice because people automatically leaned in to listen when he spoke. He caught me staring and smiled. Not the polite smile of a stranger, but something warmer, more personal. "I think I'm in the wrong seat," I said quietly, confused by his presence in this forgotten corner of the wedding. "No," he replied softly, his voice carrying a certainty that made me pause. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." Before I could ask what he meant, before I could even process his words, he leaned closer. His cologne reached me, subtle and expensive, bergamot mixed with sandalwood and something else I couldn't identify. His voice dropped to a whisper that only I could hear above the wedding march still playing in the background. "Let's pretend we came together." The words didn't make sense, but before I could respond, he placed his hand gently over my clenched fist where it rested on my lap. His touch was warm, steady, surprisingly reassuring for a complete stranger. "Just smile," he whispered. "Your son is about to look this way." I didn't understand what was happening or why this elegant stranger had chosen to sit beside me in the worst seats at the wedding. But something in his eyes, something almost familiar that I couldn't quite place, made me trust him in that moment. So, I did what he asked. I smiled. Not the forced smile I had been wearing since I arrived, but something more genuine, as if I were sitting next to someone who actually wanted to be near me. And then I saw it happen. Daniel glanced toward the back of the ceremony space, probably checking to make sure I was still safely tucked away where no one important would notice me. His eyes found row 14, found me sitting there. But now I wasn't alone. Now I was seated next to a man who radiated the kind of wealth and power that the Ashfords spent their entire lives cultivating. A man who was looking at me not with pity or dismissal, but like I was someone who mattered. Daniel's face drained of color so quickly, I thought he might faint right there at the altar. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, like a fish gasping for air. Victoria noticed his distraction and followed his gaze, her perfectly made-up face shifting from bridal radiance to confusion in an instant. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere in that garden had fundamentally changed. The minister kept speaking, reading through the traditional vows, but a current of electricity seemed to run through the assembled guests. I could hear the whispers starting in the rows behind me, spreading forward like ripples on water. "Who is that man with the groom's mother?" someone murmured. "He looks so familiar," another voice added. "My God!" whispered a woman whose voice I recognized as belonging to one of Patricia's garden club friends. "Isn't that James Hartwell from Hartwell Industries?" "It can't be," her companion replied, but her voice lacked conviction. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as more guests turned to look at row 14, where the forgotten mother of the groom now sat beside one of the most powerful men in Virginia. I kept my eyes forward, maintaining the smile the stranger had requested, but I could feel the weight of dozens of stares. The man beside me seemed completely unbothered by the attention, his hand still resting gently over mine, his posture relaxed as if he attended weddings from the service row every weekend. Patricia Ashford turned fully around in her front row seat, craning her neck to get a better look at us. This was a woman who prided herself on perfect etiquette, who had once spent an entire lunch explaining to me the proper way to eat soup at a formal dinner. The fact that she would commit such a breach of wedding protocol, turning completely around during the ceremony, told me exactly how rattled she was by this development. Her eyes narrowed when they met mine, then widened when she took in the man beside me. Her face went through a series of expressions so quickly it would have been comical if I hadn't been so confused myself. Recognition, shock, calculation, and then something that looked remarkably like fear. She whispered urgently to her husband, who also turned to look, his mouth falling open when he saw my companion. At the altar, Daniel was falling apart. The minister asked him to repeat his vows, but the words came out stammered and uncertain. He kept glancing back at us, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping even from this distance. Victoria noticed immediately. She had spent months planning every detail of this wedding, orchestrating each moment to project the perfect image of wealth and sophistication. Now her new husband was distracted, fumbling his lines, looking like he might bolt from the altar at any moment. She squeezed his arm hard enough that I saw him flinch, her manicured nails digging into his jacket sleeve. He snapped his attention back to her, but the damage was done. The perfect ceremony had been disrupted. The mother they had hidden in the back row was no longer invisible, and everyone in that garden knew it. "Perfect," the man beside me murmured, his voice carrying just a hint of satisfaction. "Now they don't know where to place you in their picture anymore." I turned to look at him fully for the first time, my voice barely above a whisper when I asked, "Who are you?" He tilted his head slightly, those deep blue eyes holding something I couldn't quite read. Something that felt like recognition and regret and anticipation all mixed together. "Someone you should have crossed paths with again a long time ago. Eleanor," he said. My heart stopped. The way he said my name, Eleanor, with just that slight emphasis on the first syllable, the way his voice wrapped around it like he had been practicing saying it for years. No one had said my name like that in decades. Not since I was 17 years old, sitting on my mother's front porch with a boy who promised he would write to me from college, who promised he would come back for me, who disappeared one September morning and never returned. The minister pronounced Daniel and Victoria husband and wife. The guests erupted in applause, the sound sharp and sudden in the afternoon air. Cameras flashed from every direction, capturing the moment when my son kissed his new bride, sealing their union in front of Virginia's most prominent families. But I wasn't watching the altar anymore. I was staring at the man beside me, my mind racing through memories I had locked away 50 years ago, trying to reconcile the silver-haired stranger with the boy I had once loved more than I thought possible. "You don't remember me yet," he said gently, his hand still covering mine. "But you will. And when you do, everything will make sense." The applause faded as guests began to rise from their seats, preparing to move toward the reception area. The wedding was over, but I had the strangest feeling that something else was just beginning. This wasn't the end of my humiliation, the final chapter in my relegation to the margins of my son's life. This was the start of something I never saw coming, something that would change everything I thought I knew about my past, my present, and the choices that had led me to this moment. Sitting in row 14 at my own son's wedding with a mysterious stranger who knew my name. As the reception began and guests flooded toward the champagne bar, the mysterious man guided me away from the crowd with a gentle pressure on my elbow. We walked through the estate's private garden, past rows of lavender that released their fragrance as our clothes brushed against them, the sound of music and laughter fading behind us until it became just a distant hum. He led me to a small stone bench beneath an oak tree that must have been planted when the estate was first built, its branches creating a natural canopy above us. When he turned to face me fully, the filtered sunlight through the leaves caught his eyes, and I saw something there that made my breath catch in my throat. "It's been 50 years, Eleanor," he said, and the way he said it, with such certainty, such weight, made my knees weak. 50 years. The number hung in the air between us like a living thing. And suddenly I was 17 again, standing on my mother's porch, watching a car disappear down the road. "James," I whispered, my voice cracking on the name I hadn't spoken aloud in decades. "James Hartwell." He smiled then. That same crooked smile that had made me fall in love with him during the summer of 1974. The smile that was slightly higher on the left side. The smile I had tried so hard to forget. "Yes," he said simply, and that one word contained multitudes. James Hartwell had been everything to me once. We met when his family moved to Richmond for his father's business expansion, a temporary assignment that was supposed to last just through the summer. He was 18, headed to university in London in the fall. I was 17, planning to start teacher's college in Virginia. He came from money, private schools, a world where people summered in places rather than just enduring the heat. I came from my father's grease-stained hands and my mother's borrowed dignity. But none of that mattered during those 3 months. We were inseparable, spending every possible moment together, talking about books and dreams and the future we were going to build once he came back from London. He promised to write every week. He promised to call. He promised that 1 year in London was nothing compared to what we had. That he would come back for me, that we would find a way to bridge the gap between his world and mine. I believed him with the kind of faith that only 17-year-old girls in love can muster. September came, and he left, and I waited. I checked the mailbox every day for weeks, then months. I called the number he had given me until it was disconnected. I wrote letters to the London address he had mentioned, but they came back marked undeliverable. By Christmas, I had convinced myself that our summer had meant nothing to him, that I had been a temporary amusement for a rich boy passing through town. By the next summer, I had met Thomas, steady and reliable Thomas, who worked with his hands and loved me in a quiet, certain way. I buried the memory of James Hartwell so deep I thought I had forgotten where I put it. But now here he stood, 50 years later, successful beyond anything I could have imagined, and he was looking at me like I was still that 17-year-old girl reading poetry on the porch. "I wrote to you," he said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Dozens of letters, Eleanor. Every week for months, then every month for a year, then every birthday and Christmas for 5 years after that. Your mother returned every single one." The ground beneath me seemed to tilt, and I had to grip the edge of the stone bench to keep from falling. "She what?" I managed to say, though my throat felt like it was closing. "She returned them all," James confirmed, pain flickering across his face like a shadow. "She included a note with the third one, saying you had moved on, that you didn't want any contact, that I wasn't the kind of person you needed in your life. She said I should stop trying to pull you into a world where you would never belong. She said you had found someone better suited to your circumstances. My mother, the woman who had raised me on dignity and hard work, who had taught me to hold my head high, who had also decided that James Hartwell, with his money and his London education, was not stable enough for her daughter. The woman who had pushed me toward Thomas at every opportunity, who had never once mentioned James's name after that summer. I never got a single letter," I whispered, and the words felt like glass in my mouth. "I thought you forgot me. I thought our summer meant nothing to you. I thought you found someone better in London and never looked back." James stepped closer and took both of my hands in his touch still familiar after half a century. "I hired a private investigator in 1976 to find you," he said. "By then you were married to Thomas, had a baby, were building a life. The investigator sent me a photograph of you, pushing a stroller through a park, laughing at something Thomas had said. You looked happy, so I stayed away. I built my business, made my fortune, had relationships that never quite worked because I kept comparing them to 3 months in 1974. I never married Eleanor. I never forgot the girl who read me Whitman and Dickinson and made me believe I could be more than just my father's money. There were tears on my face now, tears I had been holding back not just through this wedding, but through years of feeling invisible, unwanted, pushed aside. "Why are you here now?" I asked. "How did you even know about this wedding?" He smiled softly, wiping one of my tears with his thumb in a gesture so tender it made me cry harder. "Richard Ashford has been trying to buy my company for 2 years, he explained. "He sends proposals, requests meetings, has his lawyers call mine. I've been aware of his family for some time. When I saw the wedding announcement in the paper, when I saw your name listed as the mother of the groom, I knew I had to come. I told myself I would just see you from a distance, make sure you were well, then leave without disturbing your life. But when I arrived and saw them escort you to row 14, when I watched that entitled child tell you that your poverty would embarrass them, when I saw you sit there with your chin up trying not to let them see how much they had hurt you, I couldn't just watch anymore." He lifted my chin gently, so I had to meet his eyes. 50 years ago, your mother decided I wasn't good enough for you. Today, your son's new family decided you weren't good enough for them. Both were wrong, Eleanor. So very wrong. And that's about to become very clear to everyone at this wedding. We returned to the reception as dinner was being served, walking back through the garden with James's hand placed protectively on the small of my back. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a clear signal to everyone watching that I was with him, that I belonged at his side. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Heads turned as we passed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Women in designer dresses leaned toward each other to whisper behind manicured hands. Men in tailored suits tried to catch James's eye, their expressions shifting from curiosity to calculation to something approaching anxiety. The whispers followed us like a wave. "That's James Hartwell," someone said, their voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "The James Hartwell from Hartwell Industries. He owns half of Richmond's commercial real estate. What is he doing with her?" another voice asked, and I knew they meant me, the forgotten mother of the groom who had been relegated to row 14. The answer seemed to dawn on several people at once, and the whispers grew more urgent. "Is the groom's mother involved with James Hartwell? How long has this been going on? Why didn't anyone know about this?" I felt like I was walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare that had suddenly turned into something else entirely. The man I had loved and lost 50 years ago was now one of the most powerful businessmen in Virginia, and he was walking me through my son's wedding reception like I was the most important person in the room. A server approached us nervously, clearly having been sent by someone in authority. "Mr. Hartwell," he stammered. "We weren't expecting you. The seating arrangements have already been set, and I'm afraid we don't have a place prepared." James smiled pleasantly, the kind of smile that looked friendly but carried steel underneath. "That's quite all right," he said in a tone that suggested it was anything but all right. "We'll take the 2 seats at the front table, the ones currently occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton from the country club." The server's face went pale. "Sir, those seats are... the Pembertons are already..." James's smile never wavered. "Please inform Patricia Ashford that James Hartwell would like to properly congratulate the bride and groom from a seat where he can see them clearly. I'm sure she'll understand the necessity of making appropriate accommodations." The server practically ran toward the head table where Patricia Ashford was holding court, and I watched her face as he delivered the message. Her expression went through a remarkable transformation as she processed what she was hearing. Confusion came first, then recognition as she understood who was making the request, then something that looked very much like fear as the implications became clear. She knew who James Hartwell was. More importantly, she knew what he could do to her husband's business with a single phone call. Within 5 minutes, the Pembertons were being politely relocated, and James and I were being escorted to seats at the front of the reception hall, directly in line with the head table where Daniel and Victoria sat. The entire room watched this procession, watched as the woman they had dismissed and hidden was now being seated in a place of honor. I caught Daniel's eye as we sat down. His face had gone gray, his jaw slack with shock. Victoria was leaning toward him, hissing something in his ear, her perfect bridal composure cracking as she tried to understand what was happening. Patricia Ashford appeared at our table within moments, her smile so forced it looked painful. "Mr. Hartwell," she gushed, "what an unexpected pleasure. We had no idea you would be gracing us with your presence today." Her eyes flickered toward me with barely concealed confusion and disdain. "I see you've met Daniel's mother. We've actually known each other for quite some time," James said smoothly, taking my hand where it rested on the table. "In fact, Eleanor and I go back 50 years. The color drained from Patricia's face as she processed this information. 50 years, she repeated faintly. James nodded, his thumb stroking the back of my hand in a gesture that was both comforting and unmistakably possessive. "Yes," he continued. "We lost touch for a while due to some unfortunate interference. But fate has a way of bringing people back together, don't you think? Especially when one sees someone they care about being treated poorly." His tone remained pleasant, conversational, but Patricia caught the warning in his words. She excused herself quickly, returning to her seat with the kind of careful movements that suggested she was recalculating everything about this wedding and her family's future. The whispers around us had reached a crescendo. Everyone in that room knew who James Hartwell was, knew the power he wielded in Virginia's business community, knew that his presence here changed everything. The woman they had relegated to row 14, the mother they had deemed an embarrassment, was now sitting at the best table in the house with one of the most powerful men in the state. The irony was delicious. But more than that, it was a reckoning. Daniel stood up from the head table and began making his way toward us, his movements stiff and uncertain. Victoria tried to grab his arm, to stop him, but he shook her off. When he reached our table, he stood there for a moment, looking between James and me, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words. "Mom," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Hartwell, we didn't know." James looked up at him with those sharp blue eyes that had once been young and passionate, but were now tempered by decades of building an empire. "No," James said quietly but firmly. "You didn't know. That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't know your mother's worth. You didn't know her story. You didn't know that she mattered to anyone beyond what she could do for you. But now you do. And I think it's time everyone here understood exactly who Eleanor Whitfield is." The room had gone completely silent. Every eye was on our table, every ear straining to hear what would come next. James stood slowly, deliberately, his hand still holding mine. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed reception hall, "I would like to propose a toast to Eleanor Whitfield, the mother of the groom, a woman who raised a son alone after losing her husband, a woman who worked for 38 years as a public school teacher, shaping young minds and changing lives, a woman who sacrificed everything to give her child opportunities she never had, a woman whose dignity and grace in the face of today's unfortunate seating arrangement has been truly remarkable." He paused, looking directly at Patricia and Richard Ashford. "Perhaps some of you didn't know that Eleanor and I have a history. Perhaps some of you thought she could be hidden away without consequence. You were wrong." He raised his glass higher. "To Eleanor," he said. "To second chances. To correcting old mistakes. And to making sure everyone understands that a person's worth isn't measured by their bank account, but by their character." The toast hung in the air like a challenge. Slowly, reluctantly, guests began raising their glasses. The Ashfords had no choice but to follow suit, their faces rigid with barely suppressed rage and humiliation. Daniel stood frozen beside our table, his face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension. The reckoning James had promised was beginning, and everyone in that room knew it. They came to us between the salad course and the main entree, moving through the reception hall like a small parade of forced politeness. Daniel walked stiffly, his movements mechanical, as if someone had wound him up and pointed him in our direction. Victoria clung to his arm, her bridal smile looking like it had been painted on with the same care as her makeup, perfect but entirely lifeless. Behind them, Patricia and Richard Ashford followed, their faces arranged in expressions of polite curiosity that couldn't quite hide the calculation underneath. They looked like people approaching a business negotiation rather than a family conversation, which I suppose is exactly what this was to them. "Mr. Hartwell, Richard said, extending his hand with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent decades closing deals. What an unexpected pleasure. We had no idea you would be attending. His handshake was firm but brief, the kind that acknowledged James's importance without suggesting any real connection. James took his hand with equal brevity. The pleasure is mine, Richard. When I learned that Mrs. Whitfield's son was marrying into your family, I couldn't miss the occasion. All eyes shifted to me then, and I felt the weight of their confusion and reassessment. Victoria's perfect smile flickered like a candle in wind. Mother Whitfield, she said, her voice carrying a note of accusation, you didn't mention you knew Mr. Hartwell. The way she said it suggested I had deliberately withheld information, as if I owed her a complete inventory of my life. It's Mrs. Whitfield, I said quietly but firmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. And there's a great deal about me you never asked. The words landed exactly as I intended them to, pointing out that in all the time she had known me, she had never once shown genuine interest in who I was beyond being Daniel's inconvenient mother. Daniel stepped forward then, his voice low and urgent, trying to regain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping away from him. Mom, can we talk privately? He wanted to contain this, to move it away from the audience of wedding guests, who were now watching our table with barely concealed fascination. James answered before I could even open my mouth. Actually, Daniel, I think this is a conversation everyone should hear. Families should be honest with each other, don't you agree? His tone was pleasant, conversational, but there was steel underneath it that made Daniel take a small step back. Patricia's eyes narrowed to slits, her society smile finally dropping completely. Mr. Hartwell, I'm not sure what you're implying, she began, but James cut her off with the same calm authority he had displayed all evening. I'm implying, he said, his voice carrying easily to the nearby tables, despite never rising above conversational level, that I watched your family seat the mother of the groom in row 14. Behind the service area, behind the photographers and the catering staff, I heard your daughter tell Mrs. Whitfield that her poverty would embarrass you. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which is exactly what they were. The tables around us went completely silent, forks suspended halfway to mouths, conversations dying mid-sentence. Victoria's carefully maintained composure cracked completely, her face draining of color beneath her wedding makeup. That was taken out of context, she stammered, trying to salvage something from this disaster. Was it? I said, finding my voice at last, feeling it grow stronger with each word. What context makes it acceptable to hide me like something you're ashamed of? What context justifies telling me not to speak to anyone important? What context explains putting the mother of the groom next to the garbage bins? Daniel ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, messing it up for the first time all day. Mom, please? This is my wedding. Can we not? He started, but I wasn't going to let him finish. Not what, Daniel? I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time all day, seeing not the successful consultant in his designer suit, but the boy who had let this happen. Not embarrass you? Not exist too loudly? Not remind everyone where you came from? His jaw tightened the way it used to when he was a teenager, and I caught him in a lie. That's not fair, he said. But the words sounded hollow even to him. Fair? I laughed softly, and there was no humor in it, just years of accumulated hurt finally finding voice. I worked double shifts for 18 years so you could attend private school with kids who had trust funds and vacation homes. I tutored the children of families just like the Ashfords, teaching them the same lessons I taught you, so you could afford the same summer camps and opportunities. I gave up vacations I never took, clothes I never bought, retirement savings I never accumulated, so you could stand here in that designer suit pretending you've always belonged in rooms like this. My voice didn't waver, didn't crack, didn't show the pain behind the words. And on the most important day of your life, you let them put me in the back row. You didn't defend me when she called me an embarrassment. You didn't even check on me to see if I was all right. Daniel's face crumbled for just a moment, the mask of success slipping to show the guilty child underneath. Then the mask returned, the consultant taking over again. I didn't know about the seating, he said, trying to deflect responsibility. That was Victoria's mother, he gestured toward Patricia, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the elaborate floral arrangements. And what would you have done if you'd known? I asked, my voice quiet but carrying clearly to everyone listening. Would you have moved me to a better seat? Would you have insisted I sit with family? Or would you have been secretly relieved that I was out of sight, that you didn't have to explain me to your new in-laws? The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, but no words came, because we both knew the answer. We both knew that he would have done nothing, that he would have rationalized it as keeping the peace, as not making waves on Victoria's special day. The answer hung in the air between us, unspoken but understood by everyone listening. James let that silence stretch for exactly long enough to become physically uncomfortable. Until people at nearby tables were shifting in their seats, until Patricia Ashford was gripping her champagne flute so tightly I thought it might shatter. Then he spoke again, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. Richard, I've been meaning to call you about the Ashford Development Project. The words seemed innocent enough, but Richard's composure cracked immediately, his businessman's smile faltering. The waterfront proposal? He asked, his voice slightly higher than normal. I thought that was still in negotiation with the city council. We've been working on that deal for 18 months. James smiled pleasantly. It was in negotiation, until I decided to acquire the property myself. The paperwork went through this morning at 9 a.m. I now own the entire waterfront district you were planning to develop. The color drained from Richard's face so quickly I thought he might faint right there in his expensive suit. That property was a $40 million deal, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 43 million, actually, James corrected mildly. But who's counting? He took a sip of his champagne, as if he hadn't just revealed that he had destroyed the Ashfords' biggest business venture with a single morning's transaction. I also couldn't help but notice that Ashford Holdings has been struggling with its debt ratio lately. Heavy leverage, narrow margins, 3 loans coming due in the next quarter. It's actually quite impressive that you've managed to keep things afloat this long. The financial details he was revealing were clearly not public knowledge, and Richard's face went from pale to slightly green. Patricia stepped forward, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Mr. Hartwell, I don't know what you're trying to accomplish here. I'm accomplishing nothing. Patricia, James replied calmly. I'm simply having a conversation at a wedding, sharing observations. He glanced at me with something that might have been affection or might have been strategy, then looked back at the Ashfords. But I am curious about something. When you decided to humiliate Eleanor, when your daughter whispered that her poverty would embarrass you, when you banished her to row 14 like she was something shameful, did you consider the possibility that she might matter to someone? Did it occur to you that the woman you dismissed might be important to people with more power than you'll ever have? Victoria's voice rose, shrill with panic, all pretense of bridal composure abandoned. This is insane. You can't just come here and threaten us. You can't use your money to— I can do quite a lot, actually. James interrupted mildly. That's the interesting thing about wealth, Victoria. The kind your family is desperately trying to hold on to versus the kind I've spent 50 years building. It opens doors, yes, but it also closes them. And right now, several doors are closing for your family. He turned to Daniel then, his blue eyes sharp but not unkind. I have no quarrel with you, son. You made choices I don't agree with, choices that hurt someone I care about, but they're yours to live with. However, he paused, letting the weight of that word settle over the group. I'd like you to understand something very clearly. The woman you allowed to be humiliated today, the mother you were content to hide in the back row, she's worth more than everyone in this room combined. Not because of me, not because of any money or power I might have, because of who she is. He looked at me then, and his voice softened noticeably. She raised a child alone after losing her husband. She dedicated 38 years of her life to teaching other people's children when it would have been easier to give up. She survived losses that would break most people. And she did all of it with dignity. A concept this family seems to have confused with appearances. The entire reception hall had gone utterly silent. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, frozen in place with trays of food cooling in their hands. "So here's what's going to happen," James continued, turning back to the Ashfords with that pleasant smile that seemed to terrify them more than any threat could. "You're going to treat Eleanor with the respect she deserves. Not because I'm standing here, not because I could destroy your business with 3 phone calls, but because it's the right thing to do. And if you can't manage that, if you continue to treat her as something shameful or embarrassing, well..." He paused, letting them imagine the possibilities. "I have a very good memory, and a very long reach, and I've just begun to examine your family's business dealings. I'm sure there are many interesting things to discover." The threat was clear, despite never being explicitly stated. Cross Eleanor again, and James Hartwell would systematically dismantle everything the Ashfords had built. After the confrontation, I needed air. I walked back to the garden where James had revealed his identity, needing space from the suffocating tension of the reception hall. I wasn't surprised when I heard footsteps behind me 10 minutes later. I knew it would be Daniel. He found me sitting on the same stone bench where James had told me about the letters my mother had hidden, where my past and present had collided in ways I never expected. When I looked up at him, he seemed smaller somehow, younger, like the 12-year-old boy who had cried in my arms the day we buried his father. All the success, all the expensive clothes, all the careful cultivation of his new image had been stripped away, leaving just my son, lost and confused. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on the word like it hadn't since his voice changed in 8th grade. "I'm sorry." The apology hung between us, inadequate and necessary at the same time. I didn't respond immediately. I watched the fireflies beginning to blink in the lavender bushes, their small lights reminiscent of the fireflies that used to fill our backyard when Daniel was young. He would chase them with a mason jar, determined to catch enough to make a lantern, never understanding that their light would fade in captivity. "For what exactly are you sorry?" I finally asked, my voice calm despite the storm of emotions inside me. "For the seating arrangement? For Victoria's words? For the years of slowly pushing me to the margins of your life? For the birthdays you forgot? For the Christmases you spent with her family while I ate dinner alone? For introducing me as your mother only when absolutely necessary?" He flinched at each question, each one a small wound that needed to be acknowledged. "All of it," he said, his shoulders sagging. "I don't know how I got here. I don't know when I became this person." "I do," I said, turning to face him fully. "You got scared. You found a world that seemed shinier than the one you came from, full of people who had never worried about mortgage payments or medical bills or whether they could afford new school shoes. You were afraid they would figure out you didn't belong there, that you were just a kid from a small town whose mother was a public school teacher. So you started erasing the parts of yourself that reminded you where you started. Your accent changed first, then your clothes, then your stories. You stopped mentioning your father was a carpenter. You stopped talking about the summers you spent working at the grocery store to save for college. You eliminated everything that marked you as different from them, including me." Daniel's eyes filled with tears that he tried to blink away. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, but even he knew how hollow that sounded. "But you did hurt me." That's the thing about choices, Daniel. Intent doesn't matter as much as impact. I softened my voice slightly, remembering the boy he used to be. "Your father used to say that character isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when you think no one will notice. Today, you thought no one important was watching. You thought I would sit quietly in row 14 and disappear into the background of your new life. You were willing to let that happen. You were willing to let your wife humiliate me. You were willing to let her family treat me like I was something shameful." He wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand, a gesture I remembered from when he was small and trying to be brave. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Yes," I agreed. "You were." We stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of years of distance between us. "Can you forgive me?" he asked finally. And for the first time in years, he sounded like the son I remembered, vulnerable and genuine. I considered the question carefully, not wanting to give him false hope, but also not wanting to close the door entirely. Forgiveness isn't a single moment, Daniel. It's not a word you say and everything goes back to normal. It's a process. It's watching someone change over time and deciding whether you believe that change is real. It's seeing consistent actions that match the apology. It's rebuilding trust, one small moment at a time. I stepped closer and took his hands the way I used to when he was learning to walk, when I was teaching him to cross the street, when I was showing him how to be in the world. I love you. I've always loved you and I always will. But I don't trust you right now, and I'm tired of pretending that's okay. I'm tired of accepting crumbs of attention and calling it a relationship. He nodded, tears falling freely now, no longer trying to maintain his composed exterior. "What do I do?" he asked, sounding lost. "How do I fix this?" "You figure out who you want to be," I told him. "Not who Victoria wants you to be. Not who the Ashfords expect you to be. Not who you think you need to be to fit into their world. You figure out who you really are, at your core, when all the pretense is stripped away. And if the person you become is someone I recognize, someone your father would be proud of, someone who values authenticity over appearances, then we'll rebuild. But you have to earn it. You have to do the work, and it won't be quick or easy." He pulled me into a hug then, the first real hug we'd shared in years, not the perfunctory embraces at holidays, but a genuine moment of connection. I held him, feeling the little boy he used to be in the desperate way he clung to me. But I didn't cry. I was done crying for people who hadn't yet earned my tears. I was done mourning relationships that existed only in memory. If Daniel wanted to be my son again, really be my son, he would have to prove it through actions, not words. And only time would tell if he was capable of that transformation. In the days that followed the wedding, my phone became something I had forgotten it could be a source of connection rather than disappointment. Daniel texted every morning, and for the first time in years, they weren't obligatory messages sent from duty. He asked about my arthritis, which had been acting up with the change in weather. He remembered that I had a doctor's appointment on Thursday and asked how it went. He mentioned that he had driven past a construction site and thought about his father, about the summers when Thomas would take him to job sites and let him wear a tiny hard hat. These weren't the carefully curated messages of a son checking off a task. These were real attempts at reconnection, tentative but genuine, like someone learning to walk again after a long illness. Victoria sent a formal apology letter on cream-colored stationery with her monogram embossed at the top. The words were perfectly crafted, probably written by an assistant or copied from a template on proper etiquette for social disasters. She expressed regret for any misunderstanding and hoped we could move forward as a family. I read it once, noting the passive voice that avoided actual responsibility, the way she called it a misunderstanding rather than acknowledging what she had done. I folded it neatly and dropped it in the trash. Some apologies aren't worth keeping, especially when they're designed more to ease the guilt of the person apologizing than to heal the person who was hurt. The call that surprised me most came from Patricia Ashford on a Tuesday afternoon. I almost didn't answer when I saw her name on my phone, but curiosity won. "Mrs. Whitfield," she began, and her voice had lost its usual commanding tone. "I owe you an apology." The words sounded stiff, rehearsed, like she had practiced them in front of a mirror, but underneath the formality, I heard something else. Fear, perhaps, or maybe the first stirrings of genuine shame. The way I spoke about you, the way I treated you, was inexcusable. I let my own insecurities about position and status dictate my behavior, and I took them out on you. You didn't deserve that. I let the silence stretch between us, not to be cruel, but because I wanted her to sit with the weight of her words. Finally, I spoke. "I accept your words, Patricia. Whether I accept your apology depends on what happens next." There was confusion in her voice when she asked what I meant. "I mean that an apology without change is just noise," I explained. "Anyone can say sorry when they're afraid of consequences. Show me you're different. Show me you've learned something. Show me that you understand what you did was wrong, not because James Hartwell was watching, but because it was wrong. Then we'll talk about forgiveness." I hung up before she could respond, not out of rudeness, but because I had said everything that needed to be said. The ball was in her court now. She could either prove her apology was real through actions, or she could return to her old patterns once the fear of James's influence faded. Time would tell which path she would choose. James came to see me the next afternoon, arriving at my modest house in his expensive car that looked out of place on my simple street. He carried yellow roses, not red, and when I saw them, my breath caught. Yellow roses had been my mother's favorite, something I had mentioned once 50 years ago during that summer we spent together. The fact that he remembered such a small detail after all this time said more than any grand gesture could. "How are you feeling?" he asked as I put the flowers in water, using the good vase that usually sat empty on the top shelf. "Like I'm finally waking up from a very long dream," I told him. And it was true. The past few days had felt like emerging from fog into sudden sunlight, disorienting but clarifying. He sat beside me on the porch swing, the same swing where we had shared our first kiss in 1974, before my mother had decided he wasn't suitable, before she had hidden his letters and changed the trajectory of both our lives. The swing creaked gently as we moved, a comfortable rhythm that felt both new and familiar. "I've been thinking about all the years we lost," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "About what might have been different if your mother hadn't interfered, if I had tried harder to find you, if we had been braver." "And what conclusion did you reach?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "And I don't want to waste any more time wondering about what might have been. I want to focus on what could still be." He took my hand, his fingers still fitting perfectly between mine after all these years. "Come to Italy with me next month," he said, the invitation casual but his eyes serious. "I have business in Tuscany, a small acquisition I need to oversee, but there's a village called Montefiorale where the wine is exceptional and the sunsets are even better. I'd like to share it with you. I'd like to share a lot of things with you, if you'll let me." I looked at him. This man I had loved at 17, lost for 50 years, and found again at the worst and best moment of my life. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to grab this second chance with both hands. But another part, the part that had learned caution through hard experience, needed time. "I'll think about it," I said, and he smiled that crooked smile that still made my heart skip. "That's not a no," he observed. "No," I agreed, feeling a smile tug at my own lips. "It's not a no." 3 months later, I stood in the window of a villa overlooking a Tuscan vineyard, watching the sun paint the hills in shades of gold and amber that no photograph could ever capture. The air smelled of lavender and warm earth, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing the evening hour. I had said yes to Italy, yes to James, yes to the possibility that life could still surprise me at 67 years old. James came up behind me, sliding his arms around my waist with the comfortable intimacy of someone who had earned the right to be close. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice warm against my ear. "I'm thinking that a year ago, I was sitting in my kitchen alone, eating dinner off the same chipped plates I'd used for 30 years, wondering if anyone would notice if I disappeared. I was going through the motions of living without actually being alive, measuring my worth by how useful I was to others rather than by who I was." He tightened his arms around me, and now I'm standing in Italy with a man I never thought I'd see again, realizing that the best chapters of my life might actually still be ahead of me. I'm discovering that 67 isn't an ending but a beginning, that it's never too late to reclaim your own story. I turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same wonder I felt, the same amazement that we had found our way back to each other after half a century apart. "I spent so many years making myself small, James, fitting into spaces other people carved out for me, accepting whatever scraps of attention they were willing to throw my way, being grateful for the bare minimum, telling myself that my needs didn't matter because everyone else's were more important. I became an expert at disappearing in plain sight, at being useful but not visible, necessary but not valued. And now," he prompted, his hands gentle on my face, "now I know better. My worth was never about who noticed me, or where they seated me, or whether they thought I was good enough for their world. It was about who I am, who I've always been, even when no one was looking. The teacher who stayed late to help struggling students. The mother who sacrificed everything for her child. The widow who kept going when it would have been easier to give up. The woman who maintained her dignity even when others tried to strip it away." He kissed my forehead with infinite tenderness. "The person I fell in love with 50 years ago," he said. The girl who read poetry with such passion, it made me believe words could change the world. The woman who saw past my family's money to who I really was. The one who made me want to be better than I was. Yes, I smiled, feeling something settle in my chest, a peace I hadn't experienced in decades. Her. She never left. She just got buried under other people's expectations. But she was always there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. That trip to Italy was the first of many. James and I built something new together, not trying to recapture what we'd had as teenagers, but creating something deeper and more meaningful. We were partners in the truest sense, supporting each other as we navigated this unexpected second act of our lives. We traveled to places I had only seen in magazines, but more importantly, we spent quiet evenings reading together, cooking simple meals, talking about everything and nothing. Daniel and I began rebuilding our relationship, slowly, carefully, like constructing a house on ground that had once been shaky. He came to visit without Victoria sometimes, driving down on Saturday mornings to help me in the garden. We would work side by side in comfortable silence, planting tomatoes and pulling weeds, and gradually the silence would fill with conversation. He talked about his father for the first time in years, sharing memories I didn't know he had kept. He remembered Thomas teaching him to measure twice and cut once, to respect the wood and the tools, to take pride in creating something with his own hands. He admitted that he had been ashamed of his father's blue-collar job when he started college, that he had told people Thomas was in construction management rather than admitting he was a carpenter. The shame of that shame, he said, had eaten at him for years. It wasn't perfect, this rebuilding. There were moments of awkwardness, of old hurts resurfacing, of trust being tested. Victoria remained a cold presence in the background, civil but distant, clearly resentful of the power shift that had occurred. But Daniel was trying, genuinely trying, to become someone his father would recognize, someone I could be proud of again. He started volunteering with a program that taught carpentry skills to at-risk youth, honoring his father's memory in a way that would have made Thomas smile. He called, not because his calendar reminded him to, but because he genuinely wanted to hear my voice. Healing never happens in a straight line. It's messy and complicated, and full of setbacks. But it was real. And that was enough. If you're still watching, if you've stayed with me through this entire journey, I want you to know something important. I'm not special. I'm not braver than you, or stronger than you, or somehow blessed with unusual fortune. I'm just a woman who finally got tired of sitting in the back row of her own life. I'm someone who spent decades accepting less than I deserved because I had been taught that wanting more was selfish. But I learned, later than I should have but not too late, that there's a difference between being selfless and being invisible, between being humble and being humiliated. Maybe you're watching this from a place that feels like row 14. Maybe you're surrounded by people who don't see you, or worse, people who see you, but have decided you're not worth really looking at. Maybe you've spent years shrinking yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed for you, apologizing for existing too loudly, or too differently, or too authentically. I understand that feeling intimately. I lived it for so long that I forgot there was any other way to be. I measured my worth by how useful I was to others, how little space I took up, how few waves I made. I thought that if I just made myself small enough, helpful enough, quiet enough, eventually I would earn the love and respect I craved. But that's not how it works. People will take exactly as much as you allow them to take. They will push you as far into the margins as you're willing to go. The world will put you wherever it thinks you belong, based on your bank account, your zip code, your education, your appearance, your connections. In the back row behind the service area, in the kitchen, while others feast in the dining room. Behind everyone they've decided matters more. You don't have to stay there. That's what I need you to understand. You don't have to accept the seat they've assigned you. Your worth isn't determined by committee vote or social consensus. It's not something other people get to decide based on their own limited understanding of value. Your worth is in your spine, in the dignity my mother talked about, the kind that can't be given or taken away because it comes from within. It's in every sacrifice you've made that no one noticed, every moment of grace you've shown when you had every right to be bitter, every time you chose to keep going when stopping would have been easier, and sometimes, if you're fortunate, someone will see it. Someone will sit down beside you when you're alone and forgotten and say, "Let's pretend we came together." Someone will recognize your true value and reflect it back to you in a way that makes you remember who you really are. But even if that doesn't happen, even if no one comes to sit beside you, even if you have to walk out of row 14 alone, you can still do it. You can still stand up and walk to the front of your own story. You can still decide that you matter, that your life has meaning, that you deserve to be seen and heard and valued. Because no one gets to decide where you belong except you. No one gets to determine your worth except you. No one gets to write your story except you. Thank you for being here, for listening to my story, for letting me share this piece of my life with you. If this resonated with you, if you felt seen in my words, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me about your own row 14 moment. What would you say to the people who put you there? What would you tell your younger self who accepted that placement? Sometimes we underestimate the consequences of staying silent when others mistreat those we claim to love. If you've been putting someone you care about in row 14, whether intentionally or through your silence, this is your sign to make amends before it's too late. Subscribe now, because in our next story, you'll discover what happens when the tables turn completely and those who were once dismissed hold all the power. Every like, every comment, every share helps this story reach someone who might need to hear it today. Someone who is sitting in their own row 14, wondering if anyone sees them, if anyone cares, if anyone remembers they exist. And if you want to know what happened next, what Victoria finally said when she realized she needed something from me and how I responded, what became of Patricia Ashford's attempts to make amends, and how James and I built our new life together, make sure you're subscribed. That story is coming soon, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Take care of yourselves. Value yourselves. Refuse to be invisible in your own life. And remember, your place isn't wherever they put you. Your place isn't determined by their comfort or their prejudices or their narrow understanding of worth. Your place is wherever you choose to stand, wherever you decide you belong, wherever you claim your space and refuse to apologize for existing fully and authentically. Stand tall, stand proud, and never again accept a seat in row 14 unless that's exactly where you want to be.